What was your rank, old man? The question hit the heritage room like a nickel dropped on polished stone, small enough to sound harmless, sharp enough to make every head turn. Petty Officer First Class Evan Cole stood with one shoulder against the display case, his clean uniform pressed hard, his watch shining under the white lights, his smile carrying the easy confidence of a man who had never imagined age could outrank him. Around him, 6 younger SEALs paused near the wall of photographs, their boots planted on the waxed floor, their laughter rising before they had even decided if the joke was funny. Across from them stood Thomas Whitaker, 72 years old, white-haired, white-skinned, and still in a faded navy jacket that looked like it had survived more winters than most of the men in the room had birthdays. He held a worn leather bag in his left hand. His right hand rested loosely at his side, where an old ring caught the light and lost it again. Outside the tall glass doors, the Atlantic wind moved over the base in steady gusts, snapping the flag against its pole and pushing the smell of salt through every crack in the building. The place was built to remember men like him, but that morning, no one did. Evan looked him up and down, taking in the scuffed shoes, the tired shoulders, the visitor badge clipped slightly crooked to his jacket. "Come on," Evan said, louder now, feeding off the room. "You can tell us. Were you supply? Mess hall? Did they let you touch a radio once?" A few laughs broke loose. Not cruel enough to be called open disrespect, but not innocent either. The kind of laughter that tests the walls before someone throws a stone. Thomas did not blink. He did not tighten his jaw. He did not reach for pride like a weapon. He only looked past Evan, toward the far wall where a folded American flag sat behind glass beside a row of black and white photographs. Men with young faces. Men with salt on their sleeves. Men whose names had been engraved in brass, but whose voices were long gone from the air. The hum of the lights filled the pause. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed. The sound rolled through the room and disappeared. Evan's smile thinned, because silence was not the reaction he wanted. He wanted embarrassment. He wanted the old man to explain himself, to stumble, to prove that time had taken more from him than it had left behind. But Thomas Whitaker simply stood there, quiet as a pier at dawn, his leather bag hanging from one hand, his eyes steady in a way that made the room feel smaller. Megan Parker, the civilian records coordinator, stepped out from behind the reception desk with a tablet tucked against her chest. She had seen plenty of veterans come through that building for ceremonies, reunions, and memorial services. Some arrived wearing medals. Some arrived with families. Some arrived needing help with the door. But this man had come alone, 20 minutes early, carrying himself like he knew every inch of the place before it had been repainted, renamed, and secured by badge scanners. "Sir," Megan said gently, "may I see your invitation?" Thomas handed it over without a word. The paper was folded twice, softened at the corners, the ink slightly faded where his thumb had rested. Megan read the name printed across the middle, Thomas Whitaker. Beneath it, in smaller letters, was a line that made her eyes pause for half a second. Former Naval Special Warfare. The rank field was blank. Not missing. Locked. She tapped the screen once, then again. Nothing opened. Evan noticed and gave a short laugh. "Even the computer doesn't know who you are." More laughter followed, but weaker this time, thinner around the edges. Thomas turned his head just enough to look at Evan. There was no anger in his face. That made it worse. "That happens," he said. His voice was low, roughened by age, but even. Records forget before men do. The room quieted for a breath. Outside, the flag snapped hard in the wind. Evan pushed off the display case, still smiling, but now there was a restless edge under it. The old man had not defended himself, and somehow that felt like defiance. Thomas shifted the leather bag slightly in his hand, and the old ring on his finger flashed again beneath the lights. Megan saw 2 worn letters on it before he turned his hand inward. HG. Almost gone. Almost hidden. But not quite. She looked back at the name on the invitation, then at the locked rank field, then at the man standing alone while young warriors laughed in a room built from older sacrifices. Something cold moved through her chest. Evan was still grinning, still ready to make the next joke. But Megan was no longer smiling. And Thomas Whitaker, the man nobody knew, had not yet answered the question. The locked field on Megan Parker's tablet stayed gray no matter how many times she touched it. and that small gray box changed the air around her more than any raised voice could have done. In that building, records did not simply disappear. Names had categories. Visitors had clearances. Retired personnel had service histories, ceremony notes, seating assignments, and flags beside their profiles. But Thomas Whitaker stood in front of her with an invitation that looked ordinary, a badge that said visitor, and a service line sealed behind a wall the local system would not open. Megan felt the first quiet warning in her stomach. She had worked at the base long enough to know that some doors stayed closed because nothing important was behind them, and some doors stayed closed because too much was. Evan Cole did not see any of that. He saw an old man in scuffed shoes, standing too close to a room full of men who wore the same trident he wore now. He stepped nearer, his boots clean against the polished floor, his grin still sharp enough to cut the silence. "Sir, this hallway is for invited guests and active personnel," Evan said, making the word sir sound less like respect and more like a dare. "The public tour starts on the other side of the building." Thomas looked at the hallway, then at the brass plaque by the door, then back at Evan. "I was told to report here." "By who?" Evan asked. The letter did not say. That answer drew another low laugh from the men near the photographs. One of them looked away as he laughed, as if he already felt the joke becoming too easy. Another shifted his weight and glanced toward Megan's tablet. The room was still bright, still orderly, still lined with framed faces and folded flags. But something beneath it had begun to tilt. Megan cleared her throat. "Petty Officer Cole, he is on the list." Evan turned his head slightly. "With no rank. The field is locked." "That does not mean important," Evan said. "It could mean incomplete." Thomas said nothing. His silence seemed to settle on the floor between them, heavy and patient. Evan looked back at him and lifted his eyebrows. "You understand how this looks, right? A lot of men come through here wanting to feel close to the teams. Some of them tell stories. Some of them wear jackets. Some of them carry old bags." His eyes dropped to the leather bag in Thomas's hand. It was brown, cracked along the corners, with a brass buckle dulled by years of salt air and handling. No patches, no medals, no decoration, only a small stitched repair near the handle, careful and old. Thomas's fingers rested on it like it held something breakable, or something he had carried too long to put down. "This bag bother you?" Thomas asked. Evan smiled again. "Not the bag. The performance." Megan looked up quickly. The word landed badly. Even the younger men felt it. The laughter stopped instead of fading. Outside, a truck rolled past the building, tires hissing softly over damp pavement. The May morning had brought a thin mist off the water, and the windows wore it like smoke. Thomas turned his eyes toward the glass for a moment, watching the flag pull hard against the wind, then release, then pull again. He seemed far away and fully present at the same time. Megan checked the invitation again. "Thomas Whitaker, former Naval Special Warfare. Ceremony guest. Heritage room. No rank. No unit details. No sponsor visible." It made no sense, and because it made no sense, she stopped treating it like an error. "Mr. Whitaker," she said carefully, "do you have another form of identification with you?" Thomas nodded once and reached inside his jacket. Evan leaned back as if expecting a driver's license and another round of easy jokes. But Thomas removed a thin black wallet, opened it, and handed Megan an old identification card protected under cloudy plastic. The photograph was decades younger. The face was leaner. The hair was dark. But the eyes were the same, steady, unsmiling, and too calm for the room around them. Megan read the name, then the number, then the line below it, worn but legible enough to make her stop breathing for half a second. The tablet in her hand felt suddenly cheap. Evan noticed her expression and lost a little of his grin. "What?" he asked. Megan did not answer him. She looked at Thomas's ring again. The two worn letters near the edge were still there, almost swallowed by scratches. HG. Thomas saw where her eyes went and folded his hand slowly into a fist, not threatening, only private. Evan stepped closer, irritated now, because the room was slipping away from him and he could feel it. "All right," he said, louder than before. "Since nobody can find your rank, maybe you can tell us yourself. Or is that part of the act too?" Thomas placed the old wallet back inside his jacket. His movements were careful, almost gentle. Then he looked at Evan with the tired patience of a man who had heard louder voices in harder places and had learned which ones mattered. "Young man, he said. I came for a memorial, not a contest. Evan's jaw tightened. The words were not an insult, but they made him look small for the first time that morning. Megan lowered her tablet and took one step toward the reception desk, already deciding to call the command office. Behind her, the heritage room had gone almost completely still. The old man had not proved anything yet, but the joke was no longer funny. Megan Parker did not run to the reception desk. She walked, because running would have admitted that something was wrong, and in a military building, wrong had a way of spreading faster than sound. She kept the tablet close to her chest and let her eyes move once more across the room. Thomas Whitaker stood beside the display case, small under the bright lights, his faded jacket hanging loose from his shoulders, his leather bag still held by the handle. Evan Cole stood 3 feet away from him, too close for courtesy and too proud to step back. The younger SEALs had stopped laughing, but they had not yet understood why. They watched the old man the way men watch a closed door after hearing a noise behind it. Megan reached the desk and turned the tablet slightly away from the room. She entered the service number from the old identification card. The system spun once. Then the screen darkened and asked for command authorization. Not personnel authorization. Not visitor control. Command. Megan's throat tightened. She had seen that prompt only twice before, both times on files tied to ceremonies with flags, admirals, and families who spoke in low voices. She looked back at Thomas. He was not watching her. He was looking at the wall of photographs again, his eyes fixed on one frame near the far corner. It showed a team from another era, men standing beside a gray aircraft under a sky bleached white by sea glare. Their uniforms were older. Their faces were younger. Their names were printed beneath the frame in brass, but time had polished some letters dull. Thomas took one slow step toward it. Evan followed, not because he was invited, but because he refused to let the moment belong to anyone else. You recognize somebody? Evan asked. Thomas lifted his right hand, then stopped before touching the glass. The ring on his finger caught the light. Megan saw the 2 worn letters again. HG, carved into the metal so faintly they looked more like scars than initials. Thomas's fingers hovered over the photograph, near a young man in the back row with a narrow face, sharp eyes, and a grin that seemed out of place among the serious expressions. Hayes always hated standing in the back row, Thomas said. He said it softly, almost to himself, but the name reached Megan like a key turning in a lock. Hayes. Captain Richard Hayes commanded that wing of the facility. His father had served before him. There was a photograph in the captain's office, Megan remembered, an old one in a silver frame, showing a younger version of the same man beside the ocean, smiling like he had just talked his way out of trouble. Megan's hand moved to the desk phone. Evan frowned. For the first time, his confidence paused long enough for caution to reach him. You knew a Hayes? He asked. Thomas lowered his hand. A long time ago. Everybody says that, Evan replied, but the words came out flatter than before. He looked at the photograph, then at the old man, then at Megan by the phone. He could feel the room pulling away from him, and pride made him reach for control again. Knowing a name does not make you one of us. Thomas turned from the photograph. There was no anger in him, only a quiet distance, like part of him had stayed behind in that frozen picture while the rest had learned to keep walking. No, he said. It does not. Megan pressed the call button for the command office, but the line rang twice without answer. She swallowed and tried the direct administrative line. The younger SEAL nearest the door shifted his boots and finally stopped smiling completely. Another looked at Evan, waiting for him to ease off, but Evan mistook the silence for a challenge. He stepped toward the wall display and pointed at the old photograph. Then tell us which one was you. Thomas did not move. I was not in that frame. Convenient. I took the picture. The answer landed with no force at all, and somehow it struck harder than a shout. Megan froze with the phone against her ear. The line clicked, and a woman in the command office answered. Megan kept her voice low. This is Megan Parker in the Heritage Room. I need Captain Hayes notified immediately. We have a guest named Thomas Whitaker, former Naval Special Warfare. Locked file. Old ring marking appears to read HG. On the other end, there was a pause. Not confusion. Recognition trying to find its footing. Then the woman said, repeat the marking. Megan looked at Thomas again. The old man had folded his hands in front of him, hiding the ring from view. HG, Megan said. 2 letters. Very worn. The command office went silent. Evan saw Megan's face change, and impatience pushed him over the edge. "What is this supposed to be now?" he said. "Some secret legend routine?" Thomas looked back at the photograph one last time. His eyes rested on the young Hayes in the back row, and for a moment the white lights of the heritage room seemed colder, thinner, less real than the memory behind them. Then he turned to Evan with the same steady calm he had carried from the moment he entered. "Son," he said, "some names are not secret. They are just buried deeper than jokes can reach." The words left the room suspended, and for several seconds nobody knew where to put their eyes. Evan Cole wanted to laugh again, but the sound would not come. Megan Parker stood behind the reception desk with the phone pressed to her ear, listening to the command office go unnaturally quiet after she repeated the two worn letters on Thomas Whitaker's ring. The heritage room seemed to sharpen around them. Every framed photograph, every folded flag, every polished brass nameplate felt less like decoration and more like a witness. Outside, the wind dragged itself along the glass, and the flag snapped once, hard enough to make one of the younger SEALs glance toward the courtyard. Evan heard that snap and used it as an excuse to move. He crossed to the digital training display mounted near the briefing table, tapped the screen awake, and pulled up a coastal navigation exercise scheduled for later that afternoon. Blue lines, green zones, and white route markers spread across a satellite map of the Virginia shoreline. "All right," Evan said, trying to sound casual, trying to pull the room back under his control. "Since you took pictures and knew old names, maybe you can still read a map." Megan looked up from the phone, her face warning him without words. Evan ignored it. Pride had become a current, and he was already too far into it to turn back cleanly. Thomas did not move toward the screen. He looked at it from where he stood, about 12 feet away, one hand on the leather bag, the other folded loosely over the ring. The image reflected faintly in his eyes. Evan touched the map again, enlarging the route. "This is a standard movement problem," he said. "Nothing classified, nothing dramatic. Just terrain, timing, and judgment. Tell us what you see." One of the younger SEALs shifted his stance. Another folded his arms. They expected the old man to squint, to misunderstand the modern display, to ask where the north marker was. Thomas only studied the screen. 3 seconds passed. 4. The fluorescent lights hummed above him. Somewhere in the hallway, a cart rolled over a metal threshold with a soft clatter. Then Thomas lifted his chin slightly. "Your second route is too clean." Evan frowned. "Too clean. No friction. No bad weather allowance. No delay point if the boat misses the window." The room settled deeper into silence. Thomas nodded toward the lower edge of the map. "That inlet looks friendly from above." "It is not. Wind stacks there when the tide turns. A small craft can lose time before anyone admits it. By the time your team reaches that road, they are late, visible, and tired." Evan stared at the screen, then back at Thomas. "You got all that from looking at it?" "From looking at what you left out." The words were quiet, but they moved through the room like cold air under a door. Megan still had the phone to her ear. The woman from the command office came back on the line, voice lower than before. "Captain Hayes is being notified. Keep Mr. Whitaker there. Do not let anyone process him out." Megan's fingers tightened around the receiver. "Understood." Evan did not hear her. He was too busy trying to recover. He tapped the display again and pointed to a marked withdrawal lane. "That lane has been approved." Thomas looked at it. "By someone who trusts straight lines." A younger SEAL near the table gave a small breath, not quite a laugh, not quite surprise. Evan's face hardened. "And what would you do differently?" Thomas took one slow step closer to the map. Not eager, not theatrical, just enough for the white screen glow to touch the lines in his face. He pointed with 2 fingers, careful not to smear the glass. "You move here first. Not there. You hold at this bend until the wind shifts. You keep the road dark. You do not stack men in that narrow cut unless you enjoy explaining preventable mistakes." No one spoke. Evan looked at the route Thomas had traced, and his expression changed before he could hide it. Earlier that morning, Captain Richard Hayes had marked the same bend in red during a private review. Evan had not been in that meeting, but one of the instructors at the back of the room had. The instructor stepped forward now, slowly, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Captain Hayes flagged that exact point at 0600, he said. Evan turned on him. "You sure?" The instructor did. Not smile. "Yes." The room went still in a different way. Not suspicious now. Careful. Thomas lowered his hand and stepped back from the display as if nothing unusual had happened. Evan looked at the old man, then at the instructor, then at Megan, whose face had gone pale behind the desk. The joke was gone. In its place stood a question no one wanted to ask too loudly. Thomas Whitaker adjusted the worn leather bag in his hand and glanced again toward the old photograph on the wall. His voice, when it came, was almost kind. "Maps do not care how young a man is," he said. "They only care whether he is humble enough to read what they are trying to tell him." The silence after Thomas Whitaker spoke did not break all at once. It thinned slowly, like fog lifting off the water outside. The younger men looked from the map to the old veteran, then to Evan Cole, waiting for someone to explain how a man with a visitor badge and a faded jacket had just read the training problem better than the people assigned to teach it. Evan kept his eyes on the screen. The route glowed in blue and white across the glass, but the colors no longer looked clean. They looked exposed. The instructor near the back folded his arms and studied the bend Thomas had pointed out, his expression tight with professional respect. Megan Parker set the phone down carefully, though her fingers stayed near it, ready for the next call. She had been told to keep Mr. Whitaker there, but no one had told her how to manage a room that was beginning to understand it had made a mistake before the truth had even arrived. Thomas stepped away from the display and returned to the photograph wall. He moved without hurry. Each step seemed measured by some older rhythm than the room's tension. His shoes made a soft sound on the polished floor. His hand brushed the side of the leather bag, and for the first time Megan noticed the small stitched repair near the handle formed a shape. Not decoration, not accident, but a careful patch over an old tear. Evan saw the attention shifting again and hated it. "Plenty of people can read terrain," he said. "That does not answer the original question." Nobody answered him. Thomas had stopped before a different display case now, one filled with radios, compasses, signal lights, and a folded piece of weathered canvas labeled as equipment from maritime operations decades earlier. In the top corner of the case, behind a layer of glass, sat a small black and white photograph Megan had walked past 100 times without truly seeing. It showed the open side of a helicopter, the blurred sweep of rotor blades above it, and several men seated shoulder to shoulder, their faces caught in that strange half-light between duty and departure. Thomas stared at the picture as if it had spoken his name. A low sound passed over the building then, growing from a faint tremor into the heavy thump of rotor blades. A modern Navy helicopter moved across the sky outside, close enough for the windows to vibrate softly in their frames. The sound filled the heritage room. It rolled through the glass cases, over the flags, across the faces of men too young to remember what old sounds could wake inside an old heart. Thomas did not flinch, but his eyes changed. The room in front of him seemed to fade behind a colder image only he could see. Red light inside a narrow cabin. Salt spray on metal. A radio voice cutting through static. Young faces turned toward him, waiting for a decision. The smell of wet canvas, machine oil, and ocean wind. Not a scene of glory. Not a story told for applause. Only the weight of seconds when men depended on one another and rank mattered less than steadiness. Then the rotor's sound moved farther down the coast, and the present returned piece by piece. The white lights. The polished floor. Evan's sharp breathing. Megan's hand still resting near the phone. Thomas blinked once and lowered his gaze to the leather bag. His thumb pressed against the stitched repair as though confirming it was still there. Megan saw the movement and felt the cold warning in her chest deepen. That bag was not a prop. It was not nostalgia. It was a container for something time had failed to erase. Evan stepped closer again, but slower now. "You were there?" he asked, nodding toward the photograph, trying to make the question sound casual. Thomas did not answer. Immediately, he looked at the picture of the helicopter, then at the brass label below it. The label listed a year, an operation category, and the words archival image. No names. No explanation. No mention of the men inside. People were always where they had to be, Thomas said. Evan let out a short breath. "That is not an answer. It is the only one I brought." The younger SEAL nearest the briefing table looked down. Another swallowed and glanced toward the door, as if hoping someone with more authority would arrive and settle the strange pressure building in the room. Megan knew that person was coming. The command office had already gone quiet in the way offices go quiet when a name reaches a level above procedure. But Captain Hayes had not yet entered, and Evan still had enough pride left to mistake delay for permission. You keep talking around everything, Evan said. The rank, the file, the ring, now the pictures. If you were really part of all this, why hide it? Thomas turned from the display case. The rotor's sound had faded, but something of it remained in his face, a distant steadiness shaped by weather, time, and memory. Because the men who needed to know already knew, he said. And most of them are not here to speak for me. No one laughed. Even Evan had no answer ready. Outside, the flags snapped again in the wind, and inside the heritage room, the old photographs seemed to watch in silence as Thomas Whitaker stood alone with a past that had not yet finished arriving. The room had reached the kind of silence that makes every small sound feel deliberate. The tablet on Megan Parker's desk dimmed, then brightened again as a new notification appeared, but she did not touch it yet. Her eyes stayed on Thomas Whitaker because she had begun to understand that the important thing in the room was not the locked file, not the old ring, and not even the unanswered phone calls traveling upward through the command wing. It was the way he carried himself while being doubted. He did not perform dignity. He simply refused to set it down. Evan Cole stood near the map display with his hands at his sides, his mouth closed for several seconds longer than anyone expected. Then pride found a way back into him. It came not as laughter this time, but as irritation. The old veteran had corrected a route. He had known a name. He had reacted to a helicopter the way some men react to church bells. None of it gave Evan the simple answer he wanted, and because he could not control the mystery, he tried to reduce it. "That is a nice line," Evan said. His voice was quieter now, but sharper. "But this is not a movie. Around here, men say what they did. They state their unit. They state their rank. They stand behind it." One of the younger SEALs near the door shifted uncomfortably. The instructor who had confirmed the map error looked at Evan with a warning in his eyes, but Evan did not take it. He had already lost the room once. He would not lose it again to an old man with a locked record and a bag full of shadows. Thomas looked at him for a long moment. "You are proud of the trident on your chest," he said. Evan's chin lifted. "I earned it." "Good." The word surprised everyone. Thomas did not say it as mockery. He said it with plain respect, the kind that made Evan's anger harder to hold. "Then honor it better." The sentence landed clean. No raised voice. No insult. Just a line drawn across the floor. Evan's face tightened. Megan saw his ears redden. He was not a bad man, she realized, but he was young in the most dangerous way, old enough to be skilled and not old enough to understand what skill did not excuse. The phone on her desk rang once, a short internal tone. She picked it up before the second ring. "Heritage room," she said. The voice on the other end was different now. Male, clipped, controlled. "This is Lieutenant Markham from Captain Hayes's office. Confirm the guest is still present." Megan straightened. "Yes, sir. Mr. Whitaker is still here. Is he being questioned?" Megan looked toward Evan. "Informally, sir." There was a pause. When the lieutenant spoke again, the temperature seemed to drop. "In that, Captain Hayes is en route." Megan lowered the receiver slowly, but she did not hang up. Evan saw her face and mistook concern for interference. "What now?" he asked. "Did someone finally find the rank?" Megan answered carefully. "Captain Hayes is coming." That should have ended it. In a disciplined room, the name of the commanding officer should have closed every loose mouth and straightened every careless posture. It almost did. Two of the younger SEALs stepped back from the display. The instructor turned fully toward the doorway. Even the air seemed to hold itself. But Evan heard the captain's name and felt the last piece of his pride threatened. If Captain Hayes arrived, and the old man turned out to be nothing more than a paperwork mistake, Evan would look careful. If the old man turned out to be something else, Evan would look foolish. He chose the only path his pride still recognized. He pressed harder. "Before the captain gets here," Evan said, turning back to Thomas. "Why do you not save everybody some trouble and answer one basic question?" Thomas did not move. "What rank were you?" The room seemed to brace. Megan's fingers tightened around the phone cord. The instructor's eyes narrowed. Somewhere outside, the helicopter sound was gone, replaced by the steady breath of wind against the glass. Thomas looked at Evan, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something heavier, disappointment without cruelty. "Son," he said, "the men who knew my rank did not need it to know who I was." Evan gave a hard, humorless laugh. "That is convenient." Thomas nodded once, as if accepting the cost of being misunderstood. No, he said. It is lonely. No one had an answer for that. The words settled over the room with the weight of a folded flag. Evan looked away first, but only for a second. Then, driven by the stubborn need to win a moment that had already turned against him, he lifted his voice just enough for everyone to hear. So what are we supposed to call you, then? Mr. Mystery? Master Legend? Thomas's eyes moved past him, toward the photograph of the young Hayes in the back row, toward the old helicopter image, toward the glass case that held tools from a time the room had turned into history. Thomas is fine, he said. The rest belongs to men who are not here. Behind Megan, the hallway door opened somewhere in the distance. Footsteps began moving toward the heritage room with command in their rhythm. Slow at first, then faster. Evan heard them too, but he did not yet understand that the answer he had been demanding was already walking toward him. The footsteps in the hallway carried a different kind of weight. They were not rushed in panic and not slow with uncertainty. They moved with the clipped purpose of someone who had been interrupted by a name he could not ignore. Megan Parker kept the phone near her ear even after the line went quiet, her eyes fixed on the open doorway beyond the reception desk. The younger SEALs felt it too. One by one, they straightened without being told. The instructor near the map display stepped away from the screen and folded his hands behind his back. Evan Cole remained where he was, but the set of his shoulders changed. He had heard command footsteps before. Every man in that room had. The building itself seemed to recognize them. Thomas Whitaker did not turn around. He stood before the old photograph wall, looking at the young men frozen behind glass, his leather bag resting against his leg, his ring hidden beneath his folded hand. The wind outside pressed against the windows, and the flag snapped again, hard and clean, like a hand striking canvas. Megan saw Captain Richard Hayes before anyone spoke his name. He entered from the corridor in a Navy service uniform, tall, white-skinned, broad-shouldered, his face controlled, but his eyes already searching. Lieutenant Markham followed 2 steps behind him, carrying a folder that looked too thin for the weight it had brought into the room. Captain Hayes did not look first at Evan. He did not look at Megan. He did not look at the map display, the silent seals, or the locked tablet. His eyes went straight to the old man by the photographs. For a moment, the captain stopped walking. It was not hesitation. It was recognition arriving faster than protocol. Megan watched his expression tighten, not with anger, but with something older and more personal. Hayes had the face of a man hearing his father's voice from a room that should have been empty. Thomas turned then, slowly, as if he already knew who had come through the door. The 2 men looked at each other across 12 feet of polished floor and 40 years of buried history. Captain Hayes stepped closer. His gaze dropped to Thomas's hand. Mr. Whitaker, he said, but his voice made the name sound unfinished. Thomas gave him a small nod. Captain. Hayes swallowed once. The room heard it because the room had become that quiet. May I see the ring? Evan's eyes flicked down. Megan held her breath. Thomas did not move for a second. Then he opened his hand and turned it palm down. The old ring caught the overhead light, dull silver and worn nearly smooth. The letters HG sat near the edge, almost erased by time. Captain Hayes stared at them. The color shifted in his face. Behind him, Lieutenant Markham lowered his eyes to the folder, then back to the captain, waiting for orders he suddenly understood might not be ordinary. Hayes spoke very softly. Harbor Ghost. No one else moved. The name did not echo, but it seemed to fill every display case in the room. Evan's mouth opened slightly, then closed. He looked from the ring to Thomas, then to Hayes, trying to match the quiet old man before him with the sound of a name that had just changed the floor beneath his boots. Thomas's expression did not change. That was a long time ago. Hayes looked up. His eyes were no longer searching. They had found what they had come for, and with it, something he had carried since childhood without fully understanding. My father said you were gone, Hayes said. Thomas looked toward the black and white photograph, where the younger Hayes stood in the back row with the grin that refused to age. A lot of records said that. The captain took that answer like a hand placed on an old wound, gently, without display. His jaw tightened. His eyes shone, but his voice stayed steady. He kept your name in our house for 30 years. The younger SEALs did not breathe loudly enough to be heard. Evan stood frozen beside the map display, all the easy words gone from him now. Thomas lowered his hand, covering the ring again. Your father was a good man. Hayes nodded once. But the nod carried more than agreement. It carried a son's debt, a commander's respect, and the slow anger of realizing that the man his family had honored in private had just been mocked in public. Captain Hayes turned his head at last. His eyes found Evan Cole. Evan straightened at once, but too late to erase what had already happened. Hayes did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Petty Officer Cole," he said, each word measured and cold. "Tell me you did not ask this man to prove himself for your entertainment." Evan's face went pale under the room's white lights. The answer he wanted to give had no place to stand. Before he could speak, Captain Hayes looked back at Thomas Whitaker, then at the ring, then at the photographs on the wall. The captain seemed to decide something the room had been waiting for since the first careless laugh. His shoulders squared. His voice cut through the heritage room with command sharp enough to straighten the air itself. "Stand by." Captain Hayes held the room in that single command, and every man inside felt the shift before the next word came. Evan Cole stood rigid beside the map display, but his posture no longer looked proud. It looked borrowed, as if discipline had arrived from outside him and forced his body to remember what his mouth had forgotten. The younger SEAL straightened. The instructor stepped fully to attention. Lieutenant Markham closed the folder against his side. Megan Parker stood behind the reception desk, still and quiet, her hand resting near the phone as if touching a live wire. Thomas Whitaker remained where he was, calm beneath the white lights, his faded jacket open at the collar, the old ring half hidden by his curled fingers. Captain Hayes looked at him for one more second, then turned toward everyone else. His voice dropped, but the room leaned toward it. "This man is not a visitor who wandered into the wrong hallway," Hayes said. "He is not a story, not a rumor, and not a punchline." The words moved across the polished floor and found Evan first. Evan's eyes stayed forward, but his face tightened as each sentence stripped away another layer of his excuse. Hayes lifted the thin folder Lieutenant Markham had brought and opened it just enough to glance at the first page. He did not read it. Aloud like evidence in a courtroom. He did not need to. The authority was in the way his hands held it, carefully, as though the paper carried names too heavy for casual air. "Some records are locked because they are incomplete," Hayes said. "Others are locked because the men behind them did work this country did not put on plaques." No one moved. Outside, wind rattled the glass doors, and the flag snapped so sharply that it seemed to answer him. Thomas's eyes remained on the old photographs. He looked neither embarrassed nor satisfied. If anything, he looked tired, as if respect arriving late still required strength to receive. Hayes closed the folder. "Master Chief Thomas Whitaker served in naval special warfare before most of us in this room were born." The title struck the room with a force no one could laugh away. "Master Chief." Evan's throat moved. The younger SEAL nearest the door lowered his eyes for half a second, then brought them back up, ashamed of having smiled earlier. Hayes continued, his voice steady but edged with a son's restrained emotion. "My father came home because this man refused to leave him behind when the plan failed. The weather turned, and the official timeline said there was no longer a clean option. He stopped there. No details, no spectacle, just enough truth to open the silence and let everyone feel the depth beneath it." Thomas shifted his weight slightly. The leather bag brushed his leg. His thumb touched the stitched repair again, and for an instant Megan imagined that the bag had been there too, in some older night, carrying tools, papers, or memories no museum label could ever explain. Hayes stepped closer to Thomas. The captain's face softened, but his posture remained formal. "My father used to say there was a man with a ghost name who could read the water better than other men read orders. He said that man had eyes like a harbor at night. Quiet, hard to see into, impossible to forget." Thomas looked at him then. The old veteran's voice was almost a whisper. "Your father talked too much." Hayes gave the smallest smile, and it carried grief, gratitude, and 30 years of family legend meeting flesh and bone. "Yes, Master Chief." He did. Then the smile disappeared. Captain Hayes turned back to the room, and the command returned to his shoulders. He did not look only at Evan now. He looked at every young man who had laughed, every witness who had stayed quiet, every person who needed to understand that rank was not a toy for the arrogant. "You are standing in a heritage room," Hayes said. "That word is not decoration. Heritage means the floor under your boots was paid for by men whose names you may never know. It means the older man in front of you is not less worthy because he stopped wearing the uniform every day. Evan's jaw trembled once before he locked it down. He wanted to speak, but there was nothing useful left to say. Hayes let the silence gather one last time. Then he stepped in front of Thomas Whitaker, squared his shoulders, brought his heels together, and raised his hand in a formal salute. The entire room seemed to stop breathing. Thomas did not return it at first. His eyes moved to the folded flag behind glass, then to the photograph of the younger Hayes in the back row, then back to the captain standing before him. Slowly, with the weight of years in the motion, Thomas lifted his hand and returned the salute. Hayes held his salute and gave the order the room had been waiting for. Attention! Boots struck the floor as one. The sound was clean, hard, and final. Evan Cole snapped into position with everyone else, but this time there was no pride in it. Only understanding, arriving late and standing still. The salute held long enough for the meaning of it to reach every corner of the heritage room. Captain Hayes stood before Thomas Whitaker with his hand raised, and for once the younger men did not look at rank on a sleeve or shine on a badge. They looked at age, silence, and the kind of service that had survived without asking to be remembered. Thomas returned the salute with a slower hand, the movement steady despite the years in his fingers. The old ring on his hand caught the light one final time, its worn letters almost invisible unless a person knew to look closely. H.G. A ghost name. A buried name. A name that had crossed a family dinner table for 30 years and then walked back into the room wearing scuffed shoes and a faded jacket. When Captain Hayes lowered his hand, Thomas lowered his too. No one spoke. The command had been given, the room had stood, and now the silence did what lectures could not. Evan Cole remained at attention, eyes forward, jaw tight, face pale under the bright ceiling lights. He had entered the moment believing respect was something age had to earn from him. Now he understood he had been standing in borrowed air. Captain Hayes turned slightly toward him. "Petty Officer Cole," he said. Evan answered at once. "Yes, sir." The words came clean, but small. Hayes studied him for a second, then looked toward the wall of photographs. "You will stay after the memorial and read every name in this room. Out loud. Not because punishment teaches respect, but because sometimes memory does." Evan swallowed. "Yes, sir." Hayes did not press harder. He did not need to. The deepest correction had already happened in front of everyone. Thomas shifted the leather bag in his hand and glanced toward Megan Parker. She stood behind the desk with her tablet lowered, still watching him as if she had witnessed a locked door open and reveal not a secret, but a responsibility. Captain Hayes stepped beside Thomas, no longer between him and the room, but with him. "Master Chief," he said, "the front row has been reserved for Gold Star families and senior guests." Thomas shook his head gently. "I can sit in the back." Hayes's voice softened. "Not today. That was all. Not an argument. Not a ceremony within the ceremony. Just a correction of the order of things." Thomas looked toward the chairs beyond the open double doors, where the memorial service was being prepared. A small platform stood beneath the American flag. Rows of seats faced it. Programs rested on each chair, white paper folded cleanly, names printed in dark ink. The room beyond smelled faintly of floor polish, coffee, and raincoats drying near the entrance. Outside, the wind off the water moved through the courtyard, lifting the edges of flags and making the ropes tap softly against the poles. Thomas took one step, then paused beside Evan. The younger man remained rigid, but his eyes lowered at last. "Master Chief," Evan said, his voice barely above the hum of the lights, "I owe you an apology." Thomas looked at him for a long moment. He saw the embarrassment, the fear of judgment, the pride breaking down into something that might one day become wisdom. "You owe more than that," Thomas said. Evan's face tightened. Thomas continued, not unkindly. "Not to me. To the next old man you think you understand before he speaks." Evan nodded once, slow and ashamed. "Yes, Master Chief." Thomas gave a small nod in return. There was no victory in it. No need to make a young man smaller. The lesson had been heavy enough. Captain Hayes led him toward the front of the memorial hall. As Thomas passed, the younger SEALs held their posture, eyes forward, shoulders squared, not because they were afraid of the captain now, but because something older than fear had entered them. Respect. The kind that arrives late and leaves a mark. Megan watched him past the photograph wall. For a moment, Thomas turned his head toward the black and white image of the young Hayes standing in the back row. The old veteran's face softened almost beyond notice. Then he moved on. When he reached the front row, Captain Hayes waited until Thomas sat before taking his own place. Only then did the rest of the room breathe again. Evan remained standing near the heritage room door, staring at the names on the wall he had walked past for months without truly reading. The wind struck the glass once more, and the flag outside rose hard against the gray Virginia sky. Thomas Whitaker placed his leather bag beside his chair, folded his hands over the old ring, and looked toward the flag without asking anyone to know what it had cost him to get there. Some men do not need statues. Some names do not need applause. And respect should never wait for proof.